Ave Maria in the Afternoon is a co-production of Ave Maria Radio and EWTN Radio and carried across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Welcome to Ave Maria in the Afternoon, examining the world through the lens of faith from the heart of the Church to help us navigate the culture. Here's Dr. Marcus Peter.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on this hour of Ave Maria in the Afternoon. I'm Marcus Peter. We're going to begin by talking with our friend Dr. Gregory Popcak. I always enjoy it when we get to connect with each other. And today we're talking about arguments as an inevitable part of any marriage and what that does. Because when we invite God into our conflicts, He actually challenges us to approach them in a different way. And there are wisdoms, there are biblical insights, Christian truths to how couples can handle conflict and even arguments well. Dr. Greg Popcak will guide us through it. He and Lisa host More to Life at 10 a.m. every day, and it's an outstanding program. And there's a tremendous amount of wisdom for all of us who are married and who have children, and frankly, even those who are not married, to gain the wisdom and insight of the theology of the body and the scriptures and how to live faithful Catholic lives. We go on from there to talk about a particular historical event that I've been quite a student of. This has to do with the storming of the Bastille Day they call it. That's July the 14th. We just had the anniversary of Bastille Day. It's often commemorated as the French people's triumphant assertion of their liberty. But I want to talk about the two revolutions, the French and the American Revolution. I want to talk about the anthropology, the theology that undergirded these movements, what they meant, and unfortunately, as a result of it, what has become of Europe versus what became of America, and how some of these structures of human flourishing were put in place from the get-go because of the minds of the founders of America being grounded in biblical truths and natural law. And therefore, to pretend that the American Revolution was simply in tandem and therefore parallel to what came after, which was the French Revolution, is to misunderstand history and the driving ideologies behind the two movements. And that's what we're going to talk about. And then finally, to bring that conversation to a full flourishing itself, we're joined by my friend Brad Birzer of Hillsdale College. As we remember Bastille Day, we also think about how it began the French Revolution. We want to talk about, even from a socio-political perspective and from a virtuous perspective, how this differs from what we have here in the United States of America. All this after the headlines.
Thank you, Marcus, and good afternoon, everyone. This is your Ave Maria Radio News for Tuesday, July 15th. It's the feast of St. Bonaventure. And today's news is brought to you by the Ave Maria family of funds at AveMariaFunds.com. President Trump says he's disappointed but not done with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The president expressed his disappointment with Putin during an interview with the BBC, and it comes after he threatened Moscow with sanctions over its war with Ukraine. Trump's comments also follow his announcement of a deal with NATO to send more weapons, including Patriot missile systems, to Ukraine. Medical debt will remain on credit reports after a federal judge vacated a Biden-era rule. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau rule would have removed the debt. However, the judge found that the rule exceeded the Bureau's authority under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. An estimated $49 billion in medical bills would have been removed from the credit reports of about 15 million people. It would have also banned lenders from using certain medical information in loan decisions. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is demanding that Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. declare a nationwide emergency over rising measles cases. In a July 11th letter, Schumer wrote, "You have walked our country into the nation's largest measles outbreak in 33 years. According to the CDC, measles cases have spiked this year with over 1,200 confirmed cases in 39 states that have resulted in 3 deaths. The majority of cases are in unvaccinated people." And inflation is on the rise. It's up to the highest level since February at 2.7%. June numbers out today from the Labor Department show the Consumer Price Index was up 0.3% from May. With your Ave Maria Radio.net news, I'm Dan McGraw.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Arguments are an inevitable part of any marriage, but when we invite God into our conflicts, He challenges us to approach them in a different way, to approach them better. We're joined by Dr. Greg Popcak, founder and director of CatholicCounselors.com, as well as the host with his bride Lisa of More to Life, that is carried on EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network and produced here at Ave Maria Radio. Greg, great to speak with you again. How are you?
I'm doing well, Marcus. Great to be here.
So, conflicts amongst couples. Now, if there is a perfect couple out there that never has conflicts, I'd love to meet them. But given that the rest of us endure this, teach us, just share with us some of the biblical disciplines of how to fight rightly.
Well, we were talking about this on More to Life earlier today, that we often think of conflict as a sign that something is broken, but we like to think of it as an invitation from God to heal the damage that sin has done to our relationships. And, if we take up that invitation and work together with God's grace, we can grow closer to each other because of those conflicts as we respond to them. And I think the first thing that we need to keep in mind is that, usually where arguments go wrong and conflict really bears bad fruit is when we think of anger as a call to action instead of a call to prayer. So you do something that upsets me, and so if I get angry at that and I just let loose with my anger, I'm seeing my anger as a call to action. It's just a reaction to what you did that upset me. But if you do something and I feel angry about that, the first thing I really need to do is bring that to God and say, okay, Lord, Marcus really upset me. And I don't know what to do about that. Help me to know how to respond to him in a way that helps me be my best, that helps me work for his good and for the good of our relationship. So we start there, right? And then I can come to you once I've maybe thought through things a little bit and say, Marcus, when you did that, it really upset me, or I was really hurt by it. I'd like to talk through this and figure out how we can handle it better in the future, right? So there again, we're looking at the distinction that psychologists, in particular John Gottman, makes between a complaint and a criticism. So a complaint is what I just did, where I say, Marcus, when you did that, it really hurt my feelings. I'd like to figure out how we could work together to handle that better in the future. A criticism is where I'm just reacting in anger, like, Marcus, I can't believe you jerk did that to me, and how terrible, and how you're awful, and you should go pound salt. Right? So the difference, the difference there is that when it's with a complaint, I'm identifying the problem and I'm asking you to help me with it, even if you're the one who hurt me. Right? I'm presuming that that's not your intention and that we can work together through this. With a criticism, you're the problem, and I'm attacking you, and so you're going to get defensive, and we're going to start feeding off of each other at that point. But there's one other thing I'd like to introduce for Christians, right, and for Christian couples in particular. Several years ago, psychologist Eli Finkel did a TED Talk called The Marriage Hack, and he talked about a study that they did at Northwestern University that asked couples to have a difficult conversation. And they divided the couples up into two groups. So the control group, they didn't do anything with. They just said, go have a difficult conversation, have fun. And the experimental group, though, they said, before you have that difficult conversation, we want you both to take a second and imagine somebody that loves you both and wants the best for both of you. How would that person want you to handle this conversation? And then they sent those couples off to have the difficult discussion. What they found was the couples who thought about that person who loved them both and wanted the best for both of them not only did better in that experimental discussion, they continued to see improvements in their marriage for up to a year after the original study.
Wow.
Whereas the control group did not handle those discussions any better and, in fact, started to see their relationships decrease in satisfaction over the course of that year. The thing is, for Christians, we don't have to imagine somebody who loves us both and wants the best for both of us. We have a relationship with that person.
Right. And
so we need to bring those conversations to God. So before we have, as I'm starting the conversation with you or my wife or whoever, assuming that they're open to it, the first thing we need to do is say, okay, Lord, I know what I want, and Marcus knows what he wants, but help us to figure out what you want, and help us to take care of each other while we work to do that. And that's what we really encourage couples at CatholicCounselors.com to do when they're facing serious conversations. To start by saying, all right, I know where I'm at, and they know where they're at, but help us to work together to figure out what you want from us, Lord, and help us to take care of each other while we do that. And that really recenters our hearts and minds on the idea that we're working together to solve the problem. We're not the problem.
Right. And because of that, all of a sudden you're a team working on the issue and actually turning to God for grace, as opposed to trying to correct the other for the sake of remediating the issue?
Well, sure. And you know what? Even if the other person did something hurtful, we can still work together on that, because the presumption here is that you didn't want to hurt me, right? You were trying to express a need or an intention, and you didn't do it the best way. And if you had to do it over again, you'd like to do it better. So I'm assuming that about you. You're assuming that about you. So we can work together against the problem, which is you didn't know how to express that need or concern in a way that I could hear it in that moment. So we're able to not just focus on what happened and who did what to whom, but really concentrate on the next time something like this occurs again, how could we handle it better? And I think there's one other thing I want to throw out here, which is that nobody ever agrees on what really happened. And it's kind of pointless to argue about that. So even the happiest, most loving couples in the world never really agree on who said what or who started it or how did it get going. What we can both agree on, though, is that we didn't like how it went down.
Right.
And so we're going to so instead of re-arguing what happened back then, we're going to focus on when something similar to this happens in the future, how can we work better together next time? So we're not ignoring it. We're not just saying, well, we can't talk about the past. What we're doing is we're using the past as a way of framing future events and working out together how we want to handle those situations differently. And if we can root that, especially in the prayer that I suggested at the beginning of this, where we can go to God and say, all right, Lord, I know what I want, and they know what they want, but help us to figure out what you want and help us to take care of each other while we do that. Now we've got a real system for managing conflict that doesn't drive a wedge between us, but actually invites healing grace into the relationship.
And you've talked about these methods before. I mean, I hear Lisa and you teach this on your program, but you have at least 2 books that address these particular methods of approaching conflict as a couple.
That's right. For Better Forever, A Catholic Guide to Lifelong Marriage is our book that really reviews the Catholic difference in marriage and how couples can really enjoy the benefits that Catholic marriage can give them in every area, from their prayer lives to conflict management to their physical relationship. And then our other book, How to Heal Your Marriage and Nurture Lasting Love, which is really all about working through difficulties and handling challenges more effectively as a couple. And we go into much more detail in both of those books about this whole process that I described to you. Actually, we also talk about it in Praying For and With Your Spouse, which is a book that really talks about how to bring God into every part of our relationship, and so that we can have that, as the Scripture calls it, the 3-ply cord that is not easily broken between me, my wife, and God.
And I love that you mentioned that, because these are some of the things you also talk about in the Catholic HOM app. So just tell us about the app and how couples can find resources for handling conflict on it.
Sure, thank you. In fact, so every week on Catholic Home, and it's spelled HOM, it stands for Households on Mission. And every week on the Catholic Home app, we host deeper dive discussions that focus on different topics related to marriage and family life. And this week, we're having a conversation on handling family conflict. And we're talking about 2 things. Most of the places that we learn as adults how to handle conflict comes from the way we were disciplined as children. Because the way we were disciplined as kids teaches us how to deal with offenses. And most of us didn't really learn good habits there. And so this week on Catholic Home, we're having a discussion about what we call discipleship discipline, which is a gentle approach to conflict and correction, but that as adults becomes what we like to call CPR, compassionate problem resolution. And so the same steps for correcting kids become the same steps that we can use in navigating difficulties between husbands and wives and other relationships as well. And so on Catholic Home this week in our deeper dive discussion, we're talking about how to employ both of those models, whether in parenting or in marriage, so that we don't have to be afraid of conflict driving a wedge in the heart of our families, but can see conflict as that invitation to grow closer to God and to each other.
Greg, always a joy, and I'll be very honest, these particular resources that you've put out in the past have been very helpful to my bride and I, so thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. It's a pleasure to hear that, and thank you for having me on today.
My guest has been Dr. Greg Popcak, founder and director of CatholicCounselors.com. He and his bride Lisa host More to Life on EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network and the Catholic HOM app. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
Underwritten in part by the following nonprofit.
Are you paying high prices with a traditional health insurance company that pays for things that violate your conscience? There's an alternative available. Solidarity HealthShare is a community of faithful individuals and families that never share into immoral medical services, all while saving you money with prices starting as low as $85 per month for singles and $512 for families. Never fund another abortion with your healthcare dollars. Call 844-313-4999 to learn more.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
He was a pope, a saint, and a doctor of the Church.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
Pope St. Gregory I the Great is one of only 4 popes honored as the Great. Among his many achievements was sending missionaries across Northern Europe, especially St. Augustine of Canterbury, who brought Christ to the people of England. In a pun, Pope Gregory called the English people angels. He died in 604.
For more about the Doctors of the Church, visit doctorsofthechurch.com.
Ave Maria School of Law is the Roman Catholic law school in the United States. Consistently ranked in the Princeton Review as one of the best and most conservative law schools, as well as pre-law's most devout law school. Ave Maria School of Law provides a traditional legal education while emphasizing how the law intersects with the Catholic intellectual tradition and natural law philosophy. Ave Maria School of Law, unabashedly Catholic, consistently excellent. For more information, visit avemarialaw.edu.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. July the 14th, 1798, the storming of the Bastille, often commemorated as the French people's triumphant assertion of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. But beneath the crumbling stones of that medieval prison lies the ghost of something far more sinister, the deliberate rejection of God as the foundation of society. If the American Revolution was a covenantal return to divine order under just government and individual liberty, the French Revolution was not the same. In fact, if you may pardon a colloquialism here, the French Revolution was the American Revolution's bastard twin, a chaotic child of bloodlust and blasphemy, ushering in not liberty but license, not equality but envy, not fraternity but fratricide. The American founding fathers had significant theological diversity, so each of them from their respective traditions, but still, every one of them, to a man, stood in agreement on certain unshakable truths. One of these truths was the indispensability and inseparability of religion and virtue for the preservation of true and flourishing liberty. This led our first president, Washington, to famously plead in his farewell address, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. John Adams became a kind of champion for this truth, stating, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Even Benjamin Franklin, though unorthodox, confessed, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." Contrast this with the architects of the French Revolution, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, secular prophets of pride. They sought not merely to critique Christianity, but to obliterate it. Voltaire's war cry, "Écrase l'infâme," crushed the infamous thing, targeted the church as the sworn enemy of modernity. Diderot, in a gleeful orgy of nihilism, declared, "Man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest." Rousseau imagined a humanity pure in its primitive state, corrupted only by civilization, effectively declaring Eden unnecessary and sin non-existent. He replaced the cross with the collective will and substituted the Ten Commandments with the general will, that amorphous, violent abstraction later weaponized by Robespierre to justify mass executions. And their ideology was nothing short of an intellectual poison, a synthesis of anthropological naivete, moral relativism, and anti-Christian hatred. These men did not simply challenge abuses in the church and monarchy. They scorned the very concept of transcendent moral order. Their legacy continues to infect the bloodstream of modern Western society. The exaltation of the autonomous self, the enthronement of human reason as the supreme moral arbiter, and the systematic dismantling of every institution rooted in divine authority. As political philosopher Pierre Manent notes, modernity began with the proposition that man must emancipate himself from everything he did not choose, tradition, nature, and even God. The result? Where the American experiment culminated in ordered liberty and constitutional government grounded in natural law, the French Revolution devolved into a carnival of carnage. The reign of terror unleashed by Robespierre left some 16,000 people officially executed, not including the countless others who died in civil conflict and vendetta. The guillotine became the new altar of France. Reason became its new god. Notre Dame itself was rededicated as a temple of reason. And unfortunately, a prostitute was enthroned on its altar as the goddess of liberty. This was not a revolution for the common good. This was a demonic parody of liturgy. Hilaire Belloc, that bulldog of Catholic sanity, wrote soberly of the French apostasy. The faith is Europe, and Europe is the faith. Belloc warned that to the degree Europe departed from the Catholic Church, it would not merely change, it would collapse. And collapse it has. Belloc foresaw the rise of both militant secularism and Islam as the twin horsemen galloping over a post-Christian continent. The future, he warned, may see a renewal of Islam as a menace to our civilizations. One would only need to walk through the streets of Paris, where churches are abandoned and mosques overflow, to see that the old prophet was right. The truth is evident. The American and French revolutions were born of profoundly disparate anthropologies that shaped an entire ideology and political structure. The American founders unanimously embraced a biblical and natural law worldview that saw man as made in the image of God, possessing inherent dignity but also fallen. The founders acknowledged that man is capable of reason yet in need of sound, transcendent, moral restraint and divine grace. That's why James Madison echoed Jeremiah and he confessed, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." This was Federalist 51. The French philosophers, on the other hand, imagined man as inherently good, corrupted only by social institutions. Rousseau's social contract began with the absurd declaration, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains," a sentiment which denies original sin and replaces redemption with political revolution. That sounds good, but scratch the surface, and one immediately sees how this becomes a platform for systematized anarchy. And so the American liberty was covenantal. French liberty was contractual. The former sought to protect the inalienable rights endowed by the Creator. The latter believed rights were endowed by the collective will of the people, mutable and violent. The American order recognized that law was discovered as rooted in nature and nature's God. The French believed law could be invented, rewritten according to the passions of the age. And this is exactly why, unsurprisingly, the French Revolution ended not in liberty, but in the prolific dictatorship of Napoleon, and the cynical, maniacal laughter and chain rattling of Voltaire's doomed ghost. Gertrude Himmelfarb, the historian, reflected on this and astutely noted that the American Revolution was a revolution not against tradition, but for tradition, against an illegal and tyrannical government in the name of the rule of law and the rights of Englishmen. The French Revolution, by stark contrast, was a revolt not only against monarchy but against metaphysics itself. It was not content with justice, it sought deicide, the murder of God. And what of Europe now? Well, having once crowned Christendom with cathedrals and philosophy, Europe now scrapes its knees before bureaucrats and technocrats. It has abandoned its covenant with Christ and now stumbles in the fog of progressivism and demographic self-destruction. Italy's birth rate has plummeted to 1.2. France's secularism is so sterile now that her own president Emmanuel Macron recently declared, "We must make more children," as if demographics were a mechanical issue rather than a theological one. Europe having forgotten the source of her soul, is ripe for conquest, not by war, but by replacement. Islam, whose adherents still believe in God, though wrongly, are now filling the vacuum left by a flaccid, decadent Europe. While Europeans deny the existence of objective morality, Muslim migrants proclaim theirs with conviction, however misguided. And the irony is poetic. The continent that once evangelized the world has now lost the will to reproduce, believe, or defend. Chesterton once warned, when men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing, they then become capable of believing in anything. And anything, it seems, includes climate gods, gender ideology, bureaucratic tyranny, global technocratic paganism, all of which demand sacrifice, none of which offers salvation. Europe has replaced the Eucharist with Eurovision, the altar with activism, the family with the state, and Christ the King with the cult of the autonomous self. This is not progress, it's a reversion to Babel. The bastion of Christendom is now a parade of parliaments without prayer, culture without creed, and nations without natality. We in the West must learn the lesson that the Bastilles still teach, that it is one thing to oppose tyranny, it is another to sever the roots of your own civilizational tree and expect liberty to bloom. Because liberty without God is not liberty at all, it is licentiousness in disguise. And no nation can long survive once it legalizes its own oblivion. So let the Americans recall that our revolution was born of covenant, not chaos. Let Europe repent before the final vestiges of Christendom are swallowed whole. When all history is examined, the only enduring revolution is the resurrection. Only Jesus Christ can renew hearts, families, nations, and civilizations. It is He, not reason enthroned, not liberty unbound, not progress unhinged, who is the cornerstone. All else is sinking sand. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
You like pizza? Me too. And for that, we can thank our friend, Tom Monahan. First, he starts with $900 and opens one pizza shop. Then it's worldwide, thousands of shops. But all this was just a warm-up for his greatest achievement yet. He built a university.
God inspired Tom to build up generations of men and women who have a hunger to reach the world for Christ. This place is Ave Maria University.
Visit avemaria.edu to see what's next.
Do you own popular index mutual funds or ETFs? If so, you're automatically own shares of companies that conflict with your moral beliefs. Ave Maria mutual funds are managed to conform to pro-life and pro-family values. Long-term investors can invest in the no-load Ave Maria mutual funds. The experienced professional portfolio managers make decisions based on investment fundamentals and pro-life values. You can learn more about Ave Maria mutual funds today at 866-AVE-MARIA or visit AveMariaFunds.com.
Hi, I'm Father Chris Alar of the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception. My new book, Understanding the Sacraments, unpacks the extraordinary gifts unique to the Catholic Church. Ever wonder why we baptize infants? Is confession in the Bible? And must wives be subordinate to their husbands? The answers to these more hot-button questions about the sacraments are on sale now from Marian Press at shopmercy.org. God bless you.
Support for this Ave Maria radio program comes in part by the non-for-profit St. Anthony Services. Are you shopping for mortgage products, Catholic investing, Catholic health, real estate, or estate planning? StAnthonyServices.org can help you find a Catholic professional for these needs. They regularly connect faithful citizens with faith-based professionals that share our Christian values. More information at StAnthonyServices.org or 877-LIFE-US1.
Christ is the answer with Father John Riccardo.
Are you passionate about Jesus? Are you zealous for Jesus? Are you fervent for Jesus? Are we fervent for the gospel? Are we passionate about helping this world come to know him? Is that true? It's not true for most people in the church. Is Jesus my best friend? Is he your best friend? I'm looking around the church. There's a set of guys in here who have great man caves. As I was praying this morning, I felt like the Lord said, hey, when are you going to come to my man cave? Like, you guys think a flat screen TV is really cool. Well, you should see what I got to offer. Because I and I alone, he says, can really give you what it is you're longing for. Whoever it is we're rooting for right now, they're going to lose eventually. or whatever it is that's occupying our time, one day we're going to realize it really wasn't that important. Why aren't we hanging out with the one who alone can show us what life is really all about? When was the last time you hung out in the Lord's Man Cave?
It's time for Family Man with Dr. Gregory Popcak.
Did you know that the church calls your family to be holy? It's true. Now, don't freak out. The church isn't holy because the people in it are anywhere near perfect. It's holy only because Jesus is holy, and because the Holy Spirit lives and works in it. And the same thing is true about your domestic church. Our families don't need to be perfect. We only need to open ourselves to God's grace so that we can share His love, healing, and forgiveness with each other, and with the people we meet every day out in the world. Remember, holiness isn't restricted to grand gestures. It's as simple as doing ordinary, everyday things in a way that shows God's love. For more tips on living a holier life as a family, check out our books, Parenting Your Kids with Grace and Parenting Your Teens with Grace, or visit CatholicHOM.com. I'm Dr. Greg Popcak, but you can call me Family.
To discover more ways faith can enrich your life, visit CatholicCounselors.com.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. As I mentioned earlier, on the 14th of July, the French remember Bastille Day, when revolutionaries stormed the infamous Paris prison. It's regarded as the start of the French Revolution. Joining me to talk about some of the issues of the French Revolution, especially as it pertains to the thought of Edmund Burke on the inhumanity of the French Revolution, is my friend Brad Birzer, professor of history at Hillsdale College and author of several books, including Russell Kirk, American Conservative. Brad is also the founder of The Imaginative Conservative. You can follow him at Brad Birzer, at Bradley Birzer. Brad, great to speak with you. How are you?
Hey, Marcus. I'm good. Thank you. It's very good to talk, as always.
Yeah, I always enjoy when we get to connect. It was great to see you at Acton. It was great to see you at Acton. I'm always appreciative of the good work you do.
Oh, thank you. It was good seeing you as well. I was very happy and pleased. What an amazing event.
Yeah.
Bringing so many people together and just incredible discussion, conversation, networking, just incredible.
Yeah. And in terms of conversation, it's important that we have this one. Before we go on, I think it's very important that, for the sake of our listeners, we explain who Edmund Burke was and what's his background is, and why is he talking about the French Enlightenment in this way.
Right. So Edmund Burke is actually Irish, even though we always identify him with Great Britain. But he becomes more or less an Englishman in his adulthood. But, amazing, when you look at him, he was from a Roman Catholic family, but because there were so many restrictions on Roman Catholicism in Ireland when it was under British occupation, his family raised him as a Protestant, as a member of the Church of England, along with his brothers. But his sister was raised as a Roman Catholic, and his mom remained a Roman Catholic. And I always, Marcus, for me, this is Burke, because I great sympathy for the underdog. And so when we look at someone like Edmund Burke, not only is he against the enslavement of Africans, but he's very much in favor of the rights of Asian Indians and Hindus in particular. He's in favor of the rights of Roman Catholics. He ends up being the greatest supporter in Parliament of the American Revolution. And so I think for a lot of people, they were really, really stunned when he came out against the French Revolution, because they thought that something had gone deeply wrong with Burke, and they blamed it on his age. They blamed it on decrepit thinking. But in fact, I think that when we look and we get into this conversation, it'll be pretty clear that Burke was incredibly consistent in being pro-American in his revolutionary sympathies, but anti-French in their sympathies, and the sympathies that would go along with that. But your question, if I take it right, is about the Enlightenment in particular. And I've always argued that there are a number of different enlightenments. That when we look at the American Enlightenment, it tends to be a very small movement, really just Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. But then you have the French Enlightenment under Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Diderot.
It's incredibly radical. The English Enlightenment is bizarre because it's so utilitarian with Jeremy Bentham and others. But then you get the Scottish or the Celtic Enlightenment. And that's the one that I think really is more related to the kinds of things that you and I would appreciate, Marcus. When we look at people like Edmund Burke who come out of that, David Hume, even though he was a skeptic, was an amazing philosopher and thinker, but also Adam Smith. And Burke and Smith were very close friends. And I don't think we would ever have had the second edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith's greatest work, without the influence of Edmund Burke on that. So I always, again, when I talk to my students about this, I always stress, when we say Enlightenment, we're really talking about the Scottish Enlightenment and not the French Enlightenment in the good way.
And I'm really glad that you paved that path because, like you mentioned, these names were so pivotal. And frankly, I think the average American doesn't realize how important figures from the Scottish Enlightenment are to how we think about democracy today. So people like Burke, Hume, like you mentioned, Adam Smith as well. Now, you contrast that, and this, of course, is the reason why Burke was able to take a look at what was happening in France and to look at Robespierre and Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau. And he knew where it was going. It wasn't just senility that people accused him of, that he was seeing this rightly.
Oh, absolutely. And it's, Burke knew from Bastille Day, he knew from yesterday in 1789, he knew that the revolution would go wrong. And there are a lot of reasons for that. He writes his famous Reflections on the Revolution in France, which are basically speeches he's given to Parliament. But he writes that, in late 1789 and early 1790, really before there's any great violence of the revolution, but he predicts all of that violence. And, I think he's brilliant. I want to say that in a kind of non-religious sense, though this is going to sound religious, I think he was an incredible prophet, but his prophecy wasn't because of the divine. His prophecy was simply because he had his head on straight. He knew what was going on with that. So I'm not trying to compare him to Ezekiel or Jeremiah or Isaiah, but I do think that there's something deeply prophetic in what he's doing and what he saw. And, when we look at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen, which would have been the equivalent for the French of the Declaration of Independence, that's passed in late 1789. When that's passed and you look at something like Article 3 of that declaration, it says the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body, no individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. And that, of course, is brutal. And it absolutely overturns everything in the English tradition, especially the idea of common law. It overturns everything in the American understanding. The English and the Americans are really, really good at creating local community. And the national community exists to protect the local community. But if we take the French seriously, it's just the opposite. There can be no local community without the consent of the nation as a whole. And not only does that politicize everything, but it also creates a kind of democratic totalitarianism over everything else. And that's what Burke saw. And when he saw that, looking at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen, he knew that this could only end in immense violence. There was just no other possibility, no escape route for the French once they said that. And again, I think about scholars who very lazily will write something in their textbooks like the age of revolutions, and they'll talk about the American Revolution and the French Revolution in the same breath, and I get infuriated.
Yeah.
What are you thinking? These are two radically different things, even though they both have the name revolution. And that, I suppose, is the flaw of the English language, that we have that same word for both of those things, but they're not alike. In any way, shape, or form are they alike.
You know, Brad, I think one thing we do want to highlight, too, is from what we know about history, Britain and the general British populace was slow to see what was happening in France. Burke was well ahead of his time in realizing...
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so tell us about that.
Oh, yeah. You know, there were Richard Price and other great intellectuals of the time were all in favor of the French Revolution. In fact, sentiment in England was moving very rapidly towards sympathy with the French Revolution. And so Burke standing out alone so early just seemed like this huge aberration. And again, because Burke, and we often forget this, Burke was deeply radical in his support of the American Revolution. And so people are scratching their heads saying, wait a minute, is this the same guy?
My guest is Dr. Brad Birzer, professor of history at Hillsdale College, author of numerous books, founder of the Imaginative Conservative, and we're talking about Edmund Burke and the inhumanity of the French Revolution. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
When the need for senior care arises, home is where the heart is. Visiting Angels provides home care for mom or dad up to 24 hours per day, including personal care, meals, and light housework. You may select your professional caregiver with Visiting Angels. More information at visitingangels.com or at 877-374-LIVE. That's 877-374-LIVE. Visiting Angels, America's choice in senior home care.
This program brought to you in part by Ave Maria, Florida, a big kind of small town where golf carts take you everywhere and there's always something fun around the corner. Discover championship golf, resort-style amenities, and a town center full of shopping and dining. With Ave Maria University and Ave Maria Catholic Church at its heart, it's a community full of connection and charm. More than 25 model homes are available for viewing. More information can be found at avemaria.com. That's avemaria.com.
Hello, Steve Ray here from Footprints of God Pilgrimages. Want to celebrate some amazing anniversaries this year in France? We'll visit Normandy Beach to celebrate our heroic military for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Also, the 100th anniversary of the canonization of St. Therese of Lisieux. Join us this October for our Saints and Shrines of France and a visit to the newly renovated Notre Dame Cathedral.
Find the Ave Maria Radio travel tab at avemariaradio.net.
St. Therese once told her sister Celine that when we trust ourselves and not God, our soul becomes barren and incapable of virtue. Her remedy? External works of charity. We all try to do it on our own sometimes without asking for God's help. At St. Paul Evangelization, we suggest sharing the gospel with someone who needs it. Check out streetevangelization.com to find a team near you where you can share the love of Jesus. If there isn't one in your area yet, perhaps God is calling you to start a team in your city. To learn more, visit streetevangelization.com.
Teaches that Jesus Christ is literally and wholly present, body and blood, soul and divinity, under the appearances of bread and wine. In the Bread of Life discourse documented in John chapter 6, Jesus states that he is the bread of life, and that his flesh is true food and his blood true drink. The Jews were scandalized in verse 52. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Jesus does not back down, but reiterates this teaching 4 more times over the next 4 verses. Many left in verse 66 because this teaching was truly difficult. But at no point does Jesus water down his teaching and call them back. No, he allows them to leave, and even questions his 12 apostles if they too wish to leave. Jesus intended to be understood literally, and the Jews, apostles, and the Catholic Church absolutely take him at his word. Examining the truths of the Catholic faith, this is faithforensics.org.
What are the 3 parables Jesus tells about prayer in St. Luke's Gospel? The first is what the Catechism calls the importunate friend. This is the friend who wakes a pal at midnight in order to borrow 3 loaves of bread to feed a visitor. The second parable the Catechism labels the importunate widow, who persistently pleads for her rights from a reluctant judge till the wearied judge rules in her favor. This parable illustrates the need to pray always and with the patience of faith. Jesus closes this parable with the poignant question, when the Son of Man comes, will he find any faith on the earth? The third parable centers on the Pharisee and the tax collector, commending the tax collector for his humility because he asked God to be merciful to me, a sinner, a prayer which the Church adopts as its own. This is Peggy Stanton, and this has been the Order of Malta's Minute with the Catechism.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm speaking with Dr. Brad Birzer, Professor of History at Hillsdale College and author of several books, founder of The Imaginative Conservative, and most recently this article, Burke on the Inhumanity of the French Revolution. So Brad, we got cut off at the break, but like you were saying, Britain was slow on the uptake as it pertained to the direction that the French Revolution would take. Burke, however, he saw that, he called it Jacobinism by establishment or atheism by establishment. And so I'd like to ask for you to explain to our listeners why he saw that from the get-go.
Right. So, he was, again, I think it's important to remember he's sympathetic to the Catholic Church because of his sister and his mom. And he also, and I think this is an important lesson for us, Burke also realized that one of the things that was so profoundly important about the American Revolution was that its leaders were deeply Christian, very Protestant, but deeply Christian. And in 1775, in his cautionary speech to Parliament, Burke noted that we weren't just Protestant, we were the most Protestant of all Protestants. And that in that Protestantism, there was an absolute love of liberty. And I think Burke understood, and I'm projecting a little bit onto Burke with this, but I think that Burke understood that at least in the Judeo-Christian world, I don't think this works in the Muslim world, but it does in the Judeo-Christian world, that wherever religion is on the side of a revolution, that revolution will always be tradition-bound. It will be tradition-oriented. And anytime you see the revolutionaries trying to upend the religious establishment, you can imagine it's going to end in ideological warfare, civil warfare, bloodshed, violence. And, that was, if we could jump to the 20th century, if we look at the Mexican Revolution in 1917, where a number of communists took hold in places like Sonora and elsewhere, Tabasco, and elsewhere in Mexico, they were deeply, deeply anti-Catholic. Yeah. The first thing that when the Reds, when the Bolsheviks take over the Soviet Union, the very first thing, even before they go after the intellectuals, they mow down all the priests and nuns of the Orthodox Church. Yep. And, again, that's just radically different than the American Revolution, where the American Revolution was being proclaimed from the pulpits. Literally on Sundays, the ministers are there talking about natural rights and natural law and liberty and doing those kinds of things and upholding the American Revolution. So I think, Burke never says that explicitly, but I think when we read back into Burke, we can see that he's already anticipating that's what's going on. Yeah. So, Burke made this famous statement, maybe a little bit hyperbolic, but he made this famous statement that basically the French Revolution was the worst thing to happen to the world since Judas had betrayed Jesus. And, that it's a great statement. But obviously there may be a little bit of hyperbole in that. But I think what Burke was really getting at, and of course he didn't have access to the word ideology. Crazily enough, that word will be coined by Napoleon, of all people, and then enter the English language through Napoleon from the French. But what Burke called it was the armed doctrine. Right. And so that idea of the armed doctrine, that not only would we make gods out of our ideas, but then we would turn and kill in the name of those gods.
Yep.
That was something radically new. And, one of my good friends, Bruce Fronin, who's a scholar in Northern Ohio, one of the things that Bruce has noted in his own work on the American Revolution is that really, if you look at the Declaration, if you look at the Articles of Confederation, at the Constitution, and at the Bill of Rights, all of these were created in a pre-ideological world.
Yes.
Whereas the French Revolution inaugurates ideology and infects even us Americans to this day. But that, I think, to think about the founding as the last glorious moment of a non-ideological world. I think that's a great insight on Bruce. Again, Bruce Fronin is his name, but I think there's just a great insight on his part.
Yeah, I agree. And the more one becomes a student of history, the more one sees that outside of the cooperating with the work of grace, the American founding could have easily gone awry 50 million ways. That's an exaggeration.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
Going back to what you said about Burke, he recognized that an armed doctrine that was inherently atheistic, that was inherently therefore voluntaristic, this language of Rousseau's general will.
Right.
He calls it out. It was a sect aiming at universal empire. I can only imagine he was terrified at what he knew was coming, and also terrified that nobody else saw it as quickly as he did.
Right. And of course, by the end of his life, the British have started listening to him. Yep. They understand. They've seen the terror. They know what's going on. And even in places like America, it's fascinating. Thomas Jefferson wanted the French Revolution in the worst way to be his kind of revolution. And he really turned a blind eye in the first few years of the revolution, trying to give it the best face to it. But then you have someone like cranky John Adams, who knew from the first moments, like Burke did, that this thing was a disaster, an absolute disaster. And so I think we're witnessing that in two different ways. But again, there's the founding, and we could never explain American history in the 1790s without recognizing that the French Revolution really tore us apart, or at least tried to, and it was Washington that kept things together. But, this idea, are we more pro-British, these people we just separated from? Are we more pro-French because they helped us in the Revolution? This was a deep divide for America, and here we are, this fledgling republic, and we really had no business doing anything at that point off of our shores. We really needed to just focus on home at that moment. But, it became a part of the kind of revolutionary fervor to go one way or the other. But Marcus, if you don't mind, I also have to say this, and I love this about Edmund Burke. We always think of him as the founder of modern conservatism. And I think that's absolutely right. But, this is a guy who repeatedly defended the Americans during the American Revolution. He defended us before Lexington. He defended us after Lexington. He would stand up in the middle of Parliament after the king had declared a fast day of prayer. Burke would declare it a feast day in favor of the American patriots. He could have been hanged for treason for that. I mean, that's amazing to think about that. He truly, and I always tell my students, as much as we thank George Washington, we should. I love Washington. We should also thank Burke. Burke put his life on the line during that entire revolutionary period. And, there's a reason he's got a statue in Washington, D.C. And I think it's a very just reason for that.
I was actually going to bring up and ask you to comment on the sociopolitical ostracization that he faced because he was deemed a radical for standing up for the American Revolution. But then going back to how he thought about the French Revolution, and it was very clear what the French Revolution promised in utopia, it delivered in an absolutist framework. It created the way for Napoleon to become who he became.
Yes, it absolutely did that. Napoleon is the perfect example of the manifestation of everything wrong with the French Revolution. And again, and I used this term a little bit ago, and I'll use it again, I am firmly convinced that what the French created was totalitarian democracy.
Yep.
And of course, it ends in a police state, and it ends in a dictatorship. And, Napoleon, even when he's ruling, he's never unaware of what the people want. And there's a real populist streak to him in trying to make sure that the people follow what he's doing. And, he makes enemies too, lots and lots of enemies. But I very much see him as the natural consequence of the French Revolution and the terror and everything that was going on. The terror just couldn't last. They guillotined 50,000 people.
Yep.
And there was even talk at the time, there was an ex-priest who said, had totally forsaken his Catholicism, said that what they needed to do with the bodies was to create a Eucharist, a revolutionary Eucharist. He's talking about pure cannibalism, and that's the horror of the French Revolution, and it's as bad as anything we'd see later in the Soviet Union or in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge.
Brad, given everything we've just spoken about, we've got a little over a minute left in the segment. Please, as a word of exhortation and caution to all of our listeners, a lot of these French Enlightenment thoughts have creeped into our culture to the effect of the hatred of America and its founding. A word of exhortation and caution to all of us.
Yeah, that's a great question, Marcus. And I would say this. First of all, go read Burke. Burke is beautiful. He is a great writer. He is not boring in the least. I know a lot of classics are boring. Burke is not. He's beautiful. Read his various speeches, not only on America, but on France. But I would also remind Americans, all of us, our listening audience, I would remind them that we are a republic. We are not a democracy. And I think that so many of the errors in American society have come from us politicizing everything as a democracy. And in doing so, it's actually natural, in a bad way, that we're so polarized. The idea of a republic is to unify us. Democracy is to fractionalize us, and that's a dangerous thing.
Brad, always a joy. I truly am grateful.
Always, Marcus. I love it.
My guest has been Dr. Brad Birzer, professor of history at Hillsdale College, author of several books, including Russell Kirk, American Conservative. We've been talking about the heritage of Edmund Burke and how he properly described the inhumanity of the French Revolution. Let's appreciate the gift of this country and thank God. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.